Vivenda Pantaleão.
The homestead.
Corria o ano de 1931.
At 30 years old, José Tavares Rebimbas, better known as Zé Pantaleão, returned home from Newark, New Jersey, where he worked for 4 years. He met his fiancée, 22-year-old Clementina Tavares de Souza of Salado, and soon planned to get married and start a family. Armed with American dollars, Zé Pantaleão purchased from his future father-in-law, Vitorino Tavares de Souza, a farmhouse that had belonged to T. Antonio Branco and T. Calada. T. Antonio and T. Calada sold the house after falling on hard times, and the house was in disrepair and required major remodeling, which was completed by January 9, 1932, José and Clementina's wedding day. The 11 children of José and Clementina were born in this house, located in Livigada. The property consisted of a farmhouse with an open porch typical of the region. It included 6 bedrooms, 2 great rooms, the kitchen and salt room to cure and store meats, where later our father built the bathroom. Prior to the renovation, the salt room was the original kitchen, and the kitchen was the dining room. 4 of the bedrooms were located off the great rooms, and 2 were off the open porch and the ample cement terrazzo. The furnishings were modest. Some items were passed down by relatives, and some were purchased by the couple. The kitchen was tiled and featured the hearth, which included a brick oven and chimney. The small bedrooms each had a bed and a night table. The great hall, or Lord's room, had 2 chests, one with an antique cabinet, oratorio, a table, chairs, and a mirror, and framed pictures on the walls. The second hall held a wardrobe chest, a table, and a ship's suitcase, as well as various chests holding linens. Visitors approached through the gates or patio and walked up to the house, where they were always welcomed in the kitchen and served a glass of wine, and on Sunday mornings a good cup of coffee. The long, winding walkway began at the farmhouse and made its way past the farm animals. The cement terrazzo where the crops were dried ran beside the well and through the expansive backyard where the family planted and harvested the essentials, such as fruit trees, potatoes, cabbage, carrots, corn, and beans, finally ending under the grapevines that ran along the perimeter of the property. The house became vacant only after the death of José Pantaleão in March of 1978.
Está dito.
De onde vem o nome Pantaleão?
What's in a name?
Na nossa terra de origem, o Bunheiro.
Back in the day, in our hometown Bunheiro and other surrounding towns, traditionally children were named after their grandparents and godparents, and that's how we were named Vitorino, Maria de Fátima, Julia, Manuel, Antonio, Mariana, José, Maria da Glória, Tomás, Joaquim, and Pantaleão. When someone had an unusual name, his or her descendants took that name on as their family name, a practice that afforded the family instant recognition and oftentimes prestige. To this day, my contemporaries refer to the Catarinos, descendants of a Catarina, the Gaspares, descendants of a Gaspar, the Martinhos, descendants of a Martinho, and so on. Our family was no exception to this rule. The 9 Pantaleões are the great-great-grandchildren of Pantaleão André Lopes and Maria Tavares of Agro, Bunheiro. Their son, Domingos André Lopes, was known as Domingos Pantaleão in honor of his father's unusual first name. Domingos Pantaleão married Quitéria Tavares and became the parent of our grandfather, Manuel Joaquim André Tavares, better known as Manuel Pantaleão. Our grandfather, Manuel Joaquim, married our grandmother, Maria José Tavares Rebimbas, and together passed along our family names. Grandfather Manuel passed along his Pantaleão family name, and grandmother, Maria José Tavares Rebimbas, passed along her surname, Rebimbas. Rebimbas came down from the matriarchal line and had been handed down to Maria José by her mother, Maria Luísa Tavares Rebimbas, and likewise from her mother, also named Maria Luísa Tavares Rebimbas. According to tradition, our father, José Tavares Rebimbas, was better known as José Pantaleão. Even though our great-great-grandfather, Pantaleão André Lopes, had other children, none of his children, grandchildren, or great-great-grandchildren were named Pantaleão. That would change when one of his great-great-great-grandchildren, our youngest brother, Pantaleão, was born. When he was born, Senhor Frederico, the owner of the neighborhood bodega, asked our brother Zé what was the baby's name. He answered, "We are all Pantaleões, but he's the only one whose name is Pantaleão." In our children's generation, in honor of our father, Antonio and I named our first son, José Pantaleão, and in honor of our brother, Pantaleão, Zé and Rosa named their youngest son, Pantaleão. And the tradition continues. In the latest generation, our grandchildren, Joe and Lisa, surprised the family by naming their son José Pantaleão, who was better known as JP. Indeed, we dedicate the story of the family name to JP, since he is likely to have to explain, time and time again, the origin of his name. We also dedicate this story to those who today symbolically add a leaf engraved with their names to the family tree ornament, since either by birth or by marriage, they too carry the family name Pantaleão.
O nome da família Pantaleão. Está dito.
Tradições da nossa casa.
Family traditions. Growing up as a Pantaleão was hard work, sprinkled with delightful traditions steeped in religious rituals and agricultural necessities.
O dia 1 de janeiro é o dia da expressão.
On January 1st, the family, with great fanfare, quartered the slaughtered hog. The elders, Padrinhos Curto and Manuel, would report to duty early in the morning, right after Mass, and lended the event tradition and expertise. In the kitchen, the menu consisted of stew, and the following day, we would delight in the delicious rojões. On January 6th, we would celebrate King's Day, and days later, on January 10th, Dia de São Gonçalo. The agricultural works followed the seasons. In the spring, we would plant cabbage, potatoes, beans, and other vegetables for our own consumption and for sale in the farmers' market in Perdilhó and Estareja. Day workers assisted with the farming, and some practically became part of the family. This was the case with Tio João Sanfona, Tia Ana do Simão, Tio Júlio Esperança, and Senhora Albina Gavisa, who was our seamstress and on Sundays used to stop by to have a cup of coffee. Easter was our favorite holiday. We complied with the mandatory Roman Catholic religious rituals from the Lent sermons to the services of Holy Week. On Good Friday, we baked sweetbread, regueifas, and on Saturday we prepared the house with a deep cleaning, fresh flowers, and the finest linens to receive the parish priest for a much-anticipated visit and blessing on Easter Sunday. We especially enjoyed Easter dinner, the visits to our godparents and their generous gifts of sweetbread. In the spring, we plowed the fields and planted the cornfields. This was when we could hear the crickets all around us, not to mention the 30 in our brother's room. We also enjoyed the tradition of gathering seaweed, transporting it by boat, and then by cart to our courtyard. Seaweed was used as an organic fertilizer for the fields. We enjoyed planting and tending to the watermelon fields. The Leirosa watermelon field required extra protection, and we would organize a sleepover in shifts under the watchful eye of our faithful dog. When the fruit was ripe, the entire field would be sold to Manuel Maria or to Casimiro, and if not, we would sell the watermelons in the farmers' markets. In September, we would harvest the corn and hold fun-filled cascadelas, harvested the grapes, and enjoy the winemaking traditions, as well as the most anticipated feast day, São Paio, September 8th, and our own patron saint, Saint Matthew, on September 21st. In our farm, we raised cows, horses, chickens, rabbits, ducks, and sheep. It just so happened, on the day Joaquim was born, a sheep was in labor and struggling at that. Tia Rafaela was concerned. She said to our mother, "Oh, Clementina, how do you expect such a small sheep to give birth, knowing Lázaro Pombo's ram, which was considered to be one of the largest rams in Bunheiro, is the father?" And I can hear our mother answer, "Not to worry, it'll be fine." Indeed.
E assim foi.
Está dito.
Promessas a São Gonçalo.
Pledges to São Gonçalo.
Quem como eu viveu a sua mocidade
Growing
no
up in
Bunheiro,
rural Bunheiro
sabe
was hard
quanto
work,
as
made
tradições
lighter by the
da
rich,
igreja
popular, and religious traditions that mixed the sacred with the profane and brought much relief to the younger generation. Such was the case with our devotion to São Gonçalo, whose namesake chapel was located around the corner from our home, and in whose name the town's water fountain, located a block away, was named. This was also the saint evoked by most families during their nightly prayers. May São Gonçalo protect us from warts. This is because many people growing up farming the land and tending to farm animals often suffered from warts in their hands and feet. This is when the saint, and perhaps a trip to Snurgarra's pharmacy, would cure all. Groups of young men and women from the neighboring towns would flock to Bunheiro on January 10th, São Gonçalo's feast day. Groups would come from as far as Salreu and Quintas da Torreira. Prior to the construction of the Varela Bridge, the groups from Torreira and surrounding towns would travel by boat because São Gonçalo Chapel is located close to the Ribeira do Esgueirinho. A promise to São Gonçalo needed to meet certain criteria. Each devotee would comply with the criteria of the promise. Some would arrange groups of girls, others boys, others with young women named Maria, and others with couples. It was common for the young women to carry on their head over a beautiful headscarf a loaf of bread decorated with 2 carnations. The lead girl was the beneficiary of the promise, and it was customary to wear a shirt over the skirt and carry on her head a bedpan containing flour meal. Next to her, a young man would carry a pine branch, sausage, and wine curd. To complete the promise, the group would circle the chapel 9 times on their knees. Then the group would attend Mass, procession, and outdoor feast, which included music, fireworks, and a competition among men who were challenged to climb a slippery post to grab a coveted rooster. But the people's favorite promise was the one where, after praying, the girls would lift their skirts and the boys would drop their pants to show São Gonçalo what no one else was allowed to see. Never mind the parish priest's admonition that the practice was devil worship and benefited not the saint, but those who hid behind the altar. After the religious services were over, the groups would gather to eat the bread, sausage, and flour meal, relive the promise criteria, and plan another trip to São Gonçalo for the following year.
Cumprir a promessa no próximo ano.
Está dito.
Benção da Páscoa.
Easter Blessings.
Na época em que nós crescemos,
For the Pantaleão
a celebração
siblings,
mais
no other holiday
vivenciada
compared to
era o
Easter
dia de Páscoa.
Sunday, a religious milestone that centered around godchildren, and the Pantaleões were blessed with the best godparents. In our parents' home, preparations followed tradition. The house was thoroughly scrubbed, the hardwood floors were waxed, and the windows, rugs, bedding, candle holders, and flower vases were washed. The main hall was decorated with much attention to detail and a measure of pride. There was a dedicated, finely embroidered linen tablecloth, the single-stem flower vases, and the best pots of maidenhair ferns. A distinctive aroma was in the air, a cross between floor wax and spring flowers. And on Good Friday, the smell of sweetbread over which our mother labored all day, stopping only for a minute of silence at 3 p.m., at the sound of the church bells. On Easter Sunday, after High Mass, we would gather fennel and flowers and make a flower tapestry that ran from the main gate to the center hall. You could hear fireworks and shouts of hallelujah as the parish pastor and his companions made the Easter home blessing rounds throughout the neighborhood. As soon as we heard the bell, and while our father walked to the front patio to receive the visits, we would gather in the center hall. We kissed the cross, and the priest stole, and then the priest sprinkled everyone with holy water and uttered a blessing. He was accompanied by 4 men, each carrying the cross, the bell, and the holy water, and the 4th carrying a basket to collect a dozen eggs we would place on the table as a gift to the parish pastor. The table was also set with cookies, pão de ló, a delicious sponge cake, and the best house wine. Often the visitors would hand out almond candy and leave without eating anything to the children's relief. For as the visitors turned their backs, we would delight in eating all the sweets right before sitting down to the Easter Sunday dinner of chicken soup, chicken stew, and rice pudding. The afternoon was the highlight of the day as we set out to round our godparents' homes. Dressed in our new Easter outfits, we each carried a cotton bread bag and walked or rode in the horse buggy. Upon arrival, we would greet our godparents by kissing their hand and asking for their blessing. Our first stop was in Chão do Monte, at the home of Padrinho Antônio Curto and Madrinha Glória. I remember he would mark our height in the chimney post, give us each a sweetbread loaf, and offer us oranges and cookies. Next, we would visit our paternal grandmother, Maria José Rebimbas, in Agro, where she lived with her son, Padrinho Manuel. There, we received a double take of sweetbread loaves, since Madrinha Mariana, her daughter, lived next door. We feasted in rojões and chouriço. And finally, we visited Rua do Forno, the home of our mother's aunts, Maria, Mariana, and Uncle Manuel Prezada, and our grandfather Vitorino's siblings. Here, we would kiss everybody's hands and each receive a sweet bread loaf. There was no tradition of an Easter visit to Salado since our maternal grandparents, Clementina and Vitorino, had passed away by then. Our parents raised us with help from our godparents, a common practice back then. Padrinho Curto and Tia Julia, and later his second wife, and Julia's sister, Madrinha Glória in Chão do Monte, raised our sisters Julia and Glória. Madrinha Mariana and Padrinho Reverendo and our grandmother in Agro raised Vitorino and Mariana. Maria de Fátima was raised in Salado under the watchful eye of her godmother Mariana and grandfather Vitorino. May God bless them.
Nos ajudaram a criar. Bem-ajam.
Está dito.
Mês de maio, mês de maias.
May wreaths.
Uma das tradições que mais agradava
One of the young
às
women's
jovens
favorite traditions was the making and displaying of handcrafted wreaths during the month of May. Indeed, the wreaths were a source of competition among groups of friends and ultimately a sort of cat-and-mouse game between single women and young men. At the end of April, the young women would organize their game plan. They would purchase arts and crafts paper in many colors in Senhor Federico or Pinto's corner stores and decide what other materials were needed to make into window wreaths. Some worked alone, so their wreaths would be a surprise even to their friends. Others worked in teams and borrowed innovative ideas from each other, trying to outdo the team down the street. Some young women were true artists. They stuffed hay into a stocking and made a perfectly round wreath. Then they rolled thin, color paper in a crayon and removed it carefully, thus creating rose petals. Once they had fabricated enough flowers, they sewed or glued them into the wreath, turning it into a work of art. Others would make wreaths out of fresh flowers. My sister Mariana and I prefer this approach. The most daring young women, especially those who prided themselves in outdoing themselves every year, would display their wreaths in the most daring locations, so the young men would have to work hard to steal them. Most wreaths were displayed outside windows or high above the front gate. The wreaths of the most popular girls would most likely be stolen by the end of the month. Every Sunday, in the churchyard, each young man would display their captured wreaths in a rope, tied to street posts or in the wrought iron fence of the São Gonçalo chapel. Every year, the victims would resolve to work harder so their wreaths would not be stolen. This was the case with Ana do Federico, who said, "This year, nobody's touching my wreath. I'm going to tie it well, and in addition, I'm adding an electric current." But no sooner had the word traveled that Anna's wreath was off limits, it fell victim like all the others. To Anna's surprise, in the early evening hours, while she and her godmother, Senhora Ana, were in church for the daily May novena, a young man carefully bribed the dog, cut loose the wires, and walked away with the prized wreath.
Levou a tão sofisticada Maia.
Está dito.
O cortejo das flores.
The flower parade.
A primavera é a
As the
estação
seasons
mais
go in a
promissora
farm,
do ano.
nothing compares to spring. This is when the land is fertile with the most prized crops such as corn, beans, cabbage, potatoes, onions, and tomatoes. And the fruit trees turned our backyards into orchards. Our gardens, from the smallest to the most lavish, bloomed with flowers. This was also when our parish celebrated the year's highest Mass in honor of the Holy Eucharist of the Body of Christ. Prior to the religious procession, the population organized the parade of flowers, which later would be used to create a street tapestry. The parade is a town-wide effort involving all ages, but especially young women and children. The women carry the baskets on their head, and the children take baskets or flower arrangements by the hand. The baskets are carefully decorated with the most beautiful native flowers. The most common flowers are hydrangeas, dahlias, and gladiolas for their resilience and structure. Some years, the parade sponsored a contest. The parade was organized so that it started at two different ends of the town and merged mid-route. One section was the São Silvestre, or South Parade, and the other section was São Gonçalo, or the North Parade. At the point where the two parades merged, Porto Pequeno, the parish priest symbolically blessed the fields and prayed for a bountiful harvest later in the year. Then, as one, the flower parade was joined by a marching band and proceeded to the Church of the High Mass. Just prior to the Mass, the flowers were spread through the streets in preparation for the procession, which incorporated the children, all dressed in white, who had just recently received their First Communion. Our hometown Bunheiro was the only town in the area who sponsored the flower parade, and I remember the first one, which was held in 1945, when I was 11 years old. I carried a basket of red and pink gardenias. This year, 2002, the parade will be on May 30th, and I can anticipate beautiful baskets carried by Catarina's sisters, by the daughters of our cousin Manuel Nedio of Lagoa do Monte, by the daughters of Domingos Beirotto, by Lourdes Laranjeira, and by our niece Maria de Fátima Barbosa. These women always carry the tallest and most beautiful baskets. They will be accompanied by the younger generation, Angela, Ana Rita, Mariana, Ana Filipa, and others, dressed in Bunheiro style, headscarves and aprons. The youngsters will carry flowers and a beautiful tradition.
Está dito.
Aprendi mais.
The grape harvest.
Das fainas agrícolas.
The grape harvest at the end of the summer could not come soon enough. We would pick on the grapes as they ripened and anxiously waited for the end of September when friends, day workers, and the children all had a role to play. Following the preparation of the concrete vat, the barrels, the press, and baskets, the day of the grape harvest finally arrived. The youngsters had the least favorite task. They were responsible for picking off the ground any grapes that may have fallen. The young men were responsible for carrying the heavy baskets to the ox-drawn wagon, later the tractor, and take the grapes to the press propped above the concrete vat. The work would continue until the vat was full. After fermentation, the wine was stored in barrels. At the end of the harvest season and the beginning of autumn, the nights were colder and longer, and it was time to make the aguardente, or firewater. The older boys were responsible to wash the copper still in the storage shed. The men would gather at night, fill the still with pomace, and light a fire under the still. They baked sweet potatoes and chestnuts and enjoyed them with delicious warm bread hot out of Senhor Domingo's bakery oven. As they reminisced of days gone by, they filled the bottles with the aguardente. The activity was ongoing for several nights, as friends and neighbors came to use the only still in all of Bunheiro. On November 11th, São Martinho's feast day, it was traditional to taste the wine for the first time. Friends would gather in the wine cellar and assess the quality of the vintage. This is when Zé Pantaleão was subjected to his compadre Pereira's annual evaluation. This year, this is much easier on the palate. Winemaking was core to the farmer's livelihood, and it was important to upkeep the vineyards. In the winter, the vines were pruned, tied, and replaced. After the winter, the farmers would restart the heavy chores such as bringing home the seaweed which was used as fertilizer. At lunch or dinner, the wine was a welcome part of the farmer's meal. In the spring, the vines were chemically treated. The better the vines were treated and the wine cellar kept clean, the better the wine. In Casa Pantaleão, winemaking was a welcoming ritual.
Está dito.
A Cascadela e o São Mateus.
The harvest and the patron saint.
Dizia o poeta Luís de
The
Camões,
Portuguese epic poet Luís de Camões said, "We change with the times," and I agree. Anyone visiting our hometown of Pinheiro today will not see a hint of what farming was like in the Pantaleão home. For this was a time much before all the innovation and technology that arrived in 1986 when Portugal joined the European Union. In those days, the cornfields were planted and harvested by hand, and then the harvest was hauled home in an ox cart. Since the harvest began in September, often those who had to dehusk the corn were not allowed to go out on the eve of the patron saint's feast. To justify the restriction, some elders would scare the kids by saying, "These festivals are unsafe." And if you could hear the ambulance siren race to the churchyard, they would say, "You see, there's been a stabbing." At the Pantaleão home, the corn husking, called the cascadela, was planned for after supper. Friends and neighbors would have been invited with the understanding the Pantaleões would help them when needed. As people arrived, they sat on stools around the mound of corn stalks with wicker baskets between them. The larger the group, the more amused and productive, especially if there were people of all ages. I remember well Tiano do Simão, Ti Rosa Vieira, and Ti Laurinda, who boasted they were the town's most skilled corn huskers. I also remember the younger generation, Maria Aldina, Irene, Rosa do Rafael, Alice Ferreira, Maria Lagoa, and Maria Ferreira, who brought to the gathering energy and laughter. One by one, the corn husks were stripped and separated, with the corn ear going to the basket and the stalks to a pile. The stalks were then taken to the cabanal, a wooden A-frame structure where the corn was hung to dry to be preserved and used as feed, and the corn was transported to the cement terrazzo to dry. When the time was right, some unexpected guests would arrive. A few young men with white bed sheets over their faces. The fun part was trying to guess who was behind the sheets as the young men changed voices to avoid detection. They mostly wanted to know if anyone had found a red ear of corn, since that earned the right to steal a kiss. It was no surprise when after the cascadela, the young participants would go to São Mateus' feast together and start a new romance. Of all the farm chores, a cascadela was one of the most fun since it brought together friends and neighbors young and old. This was a chance to tell stories, sing, and catch up on the news. When the cascadela was over and the cleanup had been done, often the group would break into a dance. At the conclusion of the harvest season, the last cascadela would warrant sharing a dish of rice pudding or corn pumpkin meal. We so looked forward to this treat.
Está dito. Viver no campo.
Life on the farm.
A freguesia de Pinheiro,
Our hometown, Pinheiro Murtosa, is nestled in the marshlands of the Ria de Aveiro and is rich with sandy soil. The relationship between the land and the water much influenced our ancestors' lifestyles and livelihood. Until very recently, most families in our hometown were farmers and lived off the land. We were no exception. We farmed the land, raised farm animals, belonged to the Catholic Church, and lived off what we produced. We were fortunate to also have fish in abundance, including the traditional eels thanks to our father and the boys, and also some sweetbread purchased in the religious street fairs to which we looked forward. We relied on the farm for hearty meals. From corn, we produced flour. With flour, we baked bread. With corn, we also raised chickens and pigs as well as dairy cattle. We relied on the cows for milk to help us raise our children and better enjoy the morning coffee. From the vines, we made wine to last us a year and to greatly contribute to the success of the farm's hard labor. We were fortunate to have the equipment to make cachaça, which our father shared with others, much to their delight. The meals on the farm reflected the seasons. Fruits and vegetables were only available fresh and in season. The Pantaleão household, like other medium to upper income small farms, produced enough to sell and parlay the revenue in the purchase of more land, the purchase of gold jewelry for a daughter, more cattle, or farm utensils. But especially, money raised in the farmer's market would be to purchase items the farm did not produce, such as olive oil, rice, and once in a long while, a taste of bananas for the children. In the farmers' markets in Perdelhas, Perdilhó, and Estarreja, we sold vegetables, and in the larger fairs, we sold cattle. Farm animals were the only opportunity to make money, since selling off land was considered taboo. Besides eels, the marshlands yielded a great farmer's asset, seagrass. Once dry, seagrass provided the cattle with a soft bed, and the farmer with an inexpensive organic fertilizer. Firewood was another amazing resource, since it was needed to heat up bathwater, the kitchen kettles, and the brick oven. We were fortunate to have pine lands for kindle and good quality firewood that we harvested once a year. Everybody worked, from the children who had their lists of chores to the elderly who did what they could. The day started at the crack of dawn, and the chores went on until late at night. In the wintertime, reduced daylight increased the number of hours in the house, basket weaving, cutting rags for rag rugs, sewing, and praying the rosary. The many religious feasts in town and vicinity offered a necessary reprieve from the farm's hard life. Our patron saint is São Mateus, but we enjoyed many feasts, especially São Paio and Senhora da Saúde, Fevereira, and São Tomé. We also enjoyed going to Fátima, and even the long and laborious sermons Senhor Reitor subjected us to every week. It was mandatory for children to attend school through 4th grade, but some dropped out after 3rd grade because at 9 years of age, as it was said, they were old enough to work.
Está dito.
Tradições do Natal.
Christmas traditions.
Era a noite de Natal.
It was the night before Christmas at the Pantaleão house, when we were finally allowed to build a nativity scene, or presépio, while others prepared the traditional Christmas Eve feast. Preparations had started earlier in the day by getting fresh moss, pine tree branches, and beach sand. With the pine tree branches, we would create a backdrop for a village scene with peaks and valleys covered with the moss. The sand was used to create meandering trails leading to the barn. The barn was the village centerpiece and housed the main figurines, Mary, Joseph, the baby Jesus, and a cow and donkey. The sheep, the dog, and their shepherd populated the village. Later, on January 6th, we would add the 3 wise kings. This was called the presépio. Homemade ornaments decorated the pine tree branches. We made paper angels, cotton snowflakes, and shiny ornaments made out of seashells covered with aluminum foil, saved year-round from the few foil-covered cookies that came our way. At the top of the tree branch, we added a shining star made of cardboard and aluminum foil to better announce the birth of the baby Jesus. By then, it was time to join the Christmas Eve meal of boiled codfish, potatoes, kale, and the traditional roasted chestnuts. But the best part of the evening was yet to come. Before going to bed, the children would each place by the hearth 1 shoe in anticipation of the coming of the baby Jesus down the chimney. When the children were finally put to bed, Mom would coat the hearth with a thin layer of ashes. She would then bring out the youngest baby and press his bare foot in succession to create the illusion that the baby Jesus had left footprints as he walked across the hearth to fill the shoes with gifts.
Prendas nos sapatos.
Está dito.
Piquenique anual.
Annual family picnic.
O ano era 1990.
The annual Pantaleão family reunion started in 1990, about 10 years after most of the families who had lived at McWhorter and East Kinney Streets in Newark's Ironbound had dispersed and were looking to reconnect beyond the occasional celebration of a family milestone. The first reunion, also known as Family Day, was held on May 28, 1990 at YMCA Willow Camp, West Milford, New Jersey, followed by the first annual Christmas party in December of that year in the basement of McWhorter Street, Newark. Most of the family reunions have now been held at Brundage Park Complex in Randolph, New Jersey. Family Day is organized by a committee that has shared their talents and countless hours of preparation to present fun-filled, heritage-themed events. Barbecue chicken, homemade wine, organized games, children's crafts, and heritage themes and exhibits have been at the core of our reunion celebration. In 1996, in addition to the 2 annual gatherings, the family went on a Disney park and cruise vacation and celebrated 4 family weddings. In 1997 and 98, the family embarked on a process to select its values. They are health, family, honesty, and respect. The 20th anniversary Family Day celebration was dedicated to José and Rosa Rubimbas, and they were presented with a 2010 Family Day quilt.
Está dito.